The only other thing I want to piggyback on is your comment, Antoinette. You used the word good, which is a red flag for me. Again, some of you may know that I've written a lot about bad leadership, and I think it may be useful, Tom. I don't know if everybody agrees or disagrees, and I'm happy to go along with what you all decide. Whether I know that your project, Tom, is about trying to help people become good leaders, in part by clarifying, but I'm just saying that if good is what we're all after, that should be a language that we probably should share and take off the table bad. The word, how bad is defined, how good is defined, that obviously remains to be determined, but maybe we should think through, do we want to do the spectrum of from good to all the way really almost saintly to evil? Or do we want to really focus on good leaders and developing good leaders and so forth and so on?
Yeah, but do I understand that correctly? It's a red flag.
So for me, I have railed against, and I remain very alone in this, that the word leadership, I've been at Harvard for a quarter century. So at Harvard, for example, I'm at the Kennedy School, by the way, not the business school. For example, the word leadership is assumed always to have the adjective good in front of it. So I'm teaching a leadership course, and it's assumed that we're teaching about being a good leader, how to be a good leader. They don't have courses at the Kennedy School, which is a school of government. It's as if bad leadership didn't exist. And so the red flag for me is only because I've tried with very limited success to broaden the field to include the bad as well as the good. I will say one more thing, which is that's changing. There's a big Oxford book about to come out on bad leadership, which is a compendium, and Cambridge University Press is doing the same thing on dark leadership. So I think after all these years of me flailing more or less alone in the wilderness, that is beginning to change.
But it's interesting. So the construct in research that looks at bad leadership has been termed abusive supervision. They're not using the word leadership. But I agree. So if you were to look at, if you were kind of steer away from the good or bad, there's a lot of things that we subsume under effective leadership. And many people could probably mention different things. So I agree that even just the end point of what we all would like to strive for is ill-defined or not fully defined.
Yeah. I think we need to define effective and good. I understand it normatively when I come from practical wisdom. So I would come up with the common good and with virtues, but that needs to be defined. I think you cannot just assume that this is shared. And I know that we have a big discussion in leadership literature right now, and that's probably not so interesting for the practitioners that we confuse it. But we have lots of articles right now where they say, everything is only good, but I have like more a normative concept in mind. And I believe that's very important because leaders have, as you said, followers, and they can do a lot of evil to these followers. So here I believe normatively good would be something I would want to try to define within here.
There are some elements of good or effective leadership that are universal, some that are highly context dependent. So maybe it's easier to define what the universal parts are than the context dependent parts.
Can I use this opportunity to ask everyone a related question, which to me helps unpack this idea of good, bad, and contextual effectiveness? Do you differentiate between, on the one hand, growing leaders and focusing performance for leaders for whom leadership is their profession? I'm thinking of enterprise CEOs, people who are hired to do this, contrasted with people who find themselves in leadership roles, but they weren't hired for the leadership. They were simply the senior person in the engineering group. And they're the appropriate choice, but they don't think of leadership as their job. I'm thinking just real quick of an interesting example I ran across when my son defended his PhD dissertation. His PI is in physics. And the guy absolutely runs the lab, right? This guy's been there for 30 years at Northwestern. He is a leader. He is asked to lead. He exhibits none of the things that we would normally associate with effective leadership and all. And I'm wondering if that's to his discredit, if he's a brilliant physicist. And that's just a really anomalous example, again, compared with the president of the university, who hypothetically has been chosen because the leadership is the point.
So it's interesting. So we're currently doing research. I'm studying leaders' daily experiences. It's a new project where we're interviewing very diverse group of leaders. Now, they are at this point more senior, but when they start, so we asked them, what made you strive? Were you hired for this? Did you want to be a leader? And most of them, they really said, we fell into this role. I started having a team, and then I figured out how I would lead that. And then afterwards, if you're doing well in self-selection, those who want to enjoy that and would then later on be hired into other leadership role. But often the initial step is very few that say, from the very start, I want to be a leader. So there's also, and I think that comes to that discussion as well. How do we make sense of leadership when we all have a very subjective and probably more or less accurate assessment of how we act as leaders ourselves versus those around us?
There are very few organizations that would give you the choice. I'm thinking back maybe to one of my business school classes on Microsoft, where they have this twin path where you could actually become an intellectual leader without necessarily having a large team of people, or you can become a managerial leader where you would have a large team of people. And that struck me at the time where it was a career where it was very different. Didn't have those choices. It was not really established. There were some unclear criteria on how you would gravitate to the top or rise to the top. Yeah. Either through competence or political skill or some other thing, you rise to the top. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have any skills or training, and unfortunately that seems to be the case across all sorts of domains, including political world and business world.
Yeah, this is a little bit the whole problem we're facing. I'm just thinking about universities. No professor ever learned to be a leader, I would say. Always have the same topics. But we have a lot of misery in our teams because these professors never accepted that they are leaders as well. And I think here comes, in my opinion, the ethical part of leadership, because you are responsible. You can create misery. You can create also that people can develop their potential and have and flourish. And that just means for me, it would be good that we were paying attention to all leaders we have.
It's even worse, I would say, in the academic world to some extent, but I'll deal with the engineering department because that's my experience. But the skills that you need in order to grow your career as a professor are not the skills at all that you need to become a good leader.
I think this is really interesting because, so I would say, Antoinette, in any research context, you work in a team with other collaborators. There's one person who's leading projects, and you work with people. And in many ways, you can actually choose who you work with, which is a luxury, which in most other professions doesn't exist. And I think there's great leadership. You work with people you like, and someone takes the lead and leads the team to work towards an outcome. To me, so I think leadership is being learned is everywhere in that context. University administration, management, I fully agree. It's a completely different. So I think now we're all separate. And maybe that, Tom, that comes back to where Prometheus comes in. We see leadership everywhere. And I think we discard a lot of instances or occasions where people show leadership, and we only look at the very structural, visible, with positional power, the type of roles where we expect leadership, when really we should be looking in all sorts of pockets where leadership is probably already lived. We don't elevate it enough, or we discard it.
I agree. But you come from a Germanic background, and you know that we have this tendency that you have strong hierarchies. It makes also the teams, which are not much more common, more difficult because they're still under a certain hierarchy. I think in that team, you are also self-responsible, but former leaders still in a very hierarchical, power-ridden system, in my opinion, should learn more about themselves and try to be better leaders.
So we have stepped right into one of the very things Prometheus does think about, and this is this idea that if there's a cultural or structural aspect of the leadership industry that reinforces the place we're stuck in, I think one of them is that we fall into this trap of thinking of the bosses as the leadership. And bosses should be great leaders, and bosses should have great leadership capability, but so should many other people in the organization and society. And how someone leads, if you use a film as an example, who's the leader or the driver of that story is not necessarily the driver of that scene or the driver of that frame. And I would feel that Prometheus is successful if we can start to naturally think of leadership as the qualities and the capabilities that people have in their context to notice and respond in a way that's generative.
Tom, are you saying that everybody can be or should be a leader?
Yes, I would feel really that we've accomplished something if we begin to develop people to lead in the little context that they're in, the hour or the day that they're in, to notice what the situation is, notice the contrast between what is and what they'd like to have, and to respond in some way which might be the protagonist or might be the follower. But that there, to me, that's two sides of the same leadership coin, but it's being present and engaged in a way that's generative in their organization. And if they're in a really small space, that's not a huge thing to ask people to do. As they go in to be the CEO of a global company, it's a much higher demand. But they should be learning those things and adding those layers and the depth of what leadership is through their whole career.
So maybe it is all largely quality human collaboration.
I do think leadership is essentially a relationship activity. That's correct, but it's also an intellectual one, right?
Human skills, aren't they? Can be equivalently applied on a day-to-day basis outside of work.
Yeah, fully. I think we're artificially separating the work professional side, and then we call leadership, and from the personal side, we leave our personal life at the office, so we pick it up again when we go home.
I would still push back a little bit. I completely agree. There is self-leadership, there's shared leadership. We are all leaders, and we have to think about that. But we do have power in organizations. We have people who can enable that type of leadership better because they enable also by the structure that people are more flourishing, more thriving, more learning. We shouldn't see the difference in a certain degree. That might be a difference in personal development, but often it's not. Often we have people sitting in very powerful positions and they still are not very good leaders. And I think we have to take that on board as well.
I support your point. And if I'm going to, again, piggyback on it, I think it might be helpful if we make a distinction among what I call the three different resources. One is power, which is a word you just used. And I often quote Mao here, that is, power grows out of the barrel of a gun, because I think it's the power to reward, but I also think it's the power to punish. And that's very different from another kind of leadership resource, which is authority. And I know we're all familiar with the word. It comes from position or status or credential. And the third one, the one that's maybe, Tom, particularly important to you, is influence, because it really just relies on a voluntary exchange between the leader and the follower then can become the leader, and the leader becomes the follower. It's the least, of course, coercive. It doesn't involve punishment or reward, except as it's intrinsic. It's not something that somebody does to somebody else. But I would agree with the point, I think, Antoinette, that you're making, that the conversation, while the ideal may be to maximize influence, in the real world, there is such a thing as power. And in the real world, there is such a thing as authority in addition to influence. And that we probably is best to bear that in mind as the conversations continue.
Yeah, and I know I always talk about the collaborative situation, but I also say that it is contextual. In a crisis, for example, someone takes control, command and control. That's the right way to lead in that situation. It's not the time for collaboration. Someone needs to really create the cohesiveness and create the action.
So if we're playing around with words, let me just offer that if we correctly looked at high-performing collaborative systems, then in an emergency, the collaborators know to sit back and let the one leader make the decisions for everybody else. That's still a collaborative function. Maybe.
That's true.
Because frankly, knowing when to provide ideas and iteration and when it's time to move on is part of the skill set.
You mean when it's time to follow?
When it's time to what?
follow. There is such a thing, just as there is such a thing as good leadership, there is such a thing as good followership. And the point, or the situation that you're raising exemplifies it exactly.
Yeah, Barbara, could you clarify authority versus power? Because I think of them as the same thing, but I'm not arguing it.
So, no. And by the way, it's okay to argue. We're good. We're all sturdy.
Yeah.
Arguing is good. No, power, you can have power without having a title or a credential, just because somehow you're in a position to wield it. And similarly, you can be in a position of authority, such as a president or a chief executive officer. So you can have the title and the credentials, but you're not very good at exercising leadership. They're very discrete. In authority, you gain your capacity to get others to follow by your title or your status or your credential. When you have power, you have the capacity to reward or to punish. And influence, of course, is just as it sounds. By the way, to your example earlier about the physicist in the lab, if I understood you talking about your son who was getting his PhD, that person probably didn't have much power to reward or punish, but derived his capacity to lead from his credential, which was academic excellence and brilliance in a physics lab. That same person in another situation would probably or could certainly be completely inept and without any capacity either to exert power or exercise influence. That context, this person, presumably because he was, among other things, very smart and good at what he did, had authority as well as possibly some power and influence, but primarily authority because he was a brilliant physicist, or at least an extremely good one.
It's interesting that we talk about power, which is, I think, in many ways a very similarly muddied concept as leadership itself. Because if you look at sociologists and look at power as much more like the structure, the context that reconstructs power, where social psychologists look at this from the individual and you're discounting others who have a very different. But to me, leadership, I think, is a social influence process. So if we're back to defining this, I don't think you need power to lead, but the structure is the context you have to navigate. And so it helps if you have positional coercive reward power to lead, because it is easier to access resources, to make other people do what you'd like them to do. But ultimately, I think it is an influence process. And we see this in self-managed teams where you push autonomy, and we see more organizational structures that are less hierarchical. You're pushing leadership responsibilities into the team, and you have people that emerge as leaders because they're gaining, I call this informal influence, right? You don't have any sources of positional or reward, power, authority, but people follow you because they choose to.
That's what I call influence.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trust.
Yeah.
You have to gain it. Hopefully, like your spouse hopefully loves you, but you can't force him or her to do it. You have to earn that. And I guess it's the same thing with influence. I guess that would be one way to go about assessing what's good influence, good leadership.
By the way, a friendly amendment, it's not only about behavior. You can get influence because people like you and they want to be near you because they want to affiliate with you. The person's fun, that person's interesting. So in addition to behavior, there are a few other things.
Barbara, that example just opens up the question of who gets influence from privilege, for example.
Don't get me started on following. I know we're focusing on leading, but again, can't have a leader without a follower. You can't think leadership without followership. They are twinned. It's a relationship. By the way, most of us follow most of the time. You realize, Tom, we're following you. For the record, you're our leader.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're not going to be my leader in an hour. But for now, you're a leader.
Yeah.
For this context, let's get real. We're following you. If you said, okay, time's up, we would all go, okay, time's up. You say, let's meet again in a month. We're all going to go, yeah, sure, let's meet again in a month.
It's a great example of leadership not being a position, of leadership being a situation, a relationship in a situation.
Absolutely. It's an interesting question, Tom. Why are we here? You're right. You had no power, God knows, and maybe a little bit of authority, but mainly influence. Let's be clear. For this exercise, we're your followers. The question is, why are we agreeing? Why did we agree? We're all busy people. We've all got lots of things to do. And yet we agreed to follow you for this. So just a little example, Tom, because you hate the word follower, but okay, fine.
Okay.
He's also drawing on structures. We're used to have somebody who's moderating discussion to not fall into each other's words. I think there's, again, more than just the social influence process. I think we're also drawing on structures and norms all the time.